Close your eyes for a second. Ancient Greece. You can picture it perfectly, can't you? Gleaming white marble temples catching the Mediterranean sun. Brilliant philosophers gathered in open courtyards, debating the nature of the universe over cups of wine. The birthplace of democracy, of mathematics, of theater, of the Olympic Games, of every idea that the modern Western world decided to build itself upon. It sounds like paradise. It was not paradise. It was, in fact, one of the most dangerous, hierarchically brutal, medically catastrophic, and socially suffocating environments a modern human being could ever find themselves in. And unlike Rome, where the filth and the danger hit you the moment you arrived, Greece would do something far more cruel. It would let you think you were fine, right up until the moment you weren't, because the deadliest thing about ancient Greece wasn't the wars, it wasn't the slavery, it wasn't even the doctors. And the doctors were genuinely terrifying. It was the gap between what you think you know about this place and what it actually was. That gap is what kills you. Let's set the scene. We're somewhere around 400 BC. Classical Greece is at the absolute height of its cultural power. Athens is producing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in the same generation. The Parthenon sits gleaming on the Acropolis, freshly built, not yet a ruin. The city-states of Greece have just finished pushing back the Persian Empire in a series of battles that would be retold and romanticized for the next 2,500 years. On paper, this is the golden age of human civilization. But here's the first thing you need to understand about ancient Greece. It was never one place. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own laws, its own culture, its own dialect, and its own very specific way of making life extraordinarily difficult for anyone who didn't belong there by birth. And the two that matter most for our purposes sit at opposite ends of the nightmare spectrum. Athens, the so-called cradle of democracy, the city of philosophy, art, and intellectual achievement. Also a city where the famous democracy applied to roughly 10 to 15% of the population. The economy ran almost entirely on slave labor, and women had fewer legal rights than the furniture in their own homes. And then there was Sparta. Sparta was Athens with every dial turned to 11 and every concept of comfort, individuality, or mercy quietly removed from the equation entirely. Two cities, two different flavors of brutal. And you're about to spend 24 hours in one of them. Good luck. So you've arrived. Congratulations. You're standing in ancient Greece and you're already making mistakes you don't even know you're making yet. Let's start with the most immediate problem. The one that's going to define every single interaction you have for the next 24 hours. You cannot speak. You cannot read. You cannot understand a single word being said around you. And before you say, "Wait, I took some Greek in school, I know a few words," let me stop you there. Ancient Greek is not modern Greek. The pronunciation, the grammar, the vocabulary, completely different. And it gets worse. Because ancient Greece wasn't one language. It was a collection of regional dialects so distinct from each other that an Athenian and a Spartan could have genuine difficulty understanding one another. Attic Greek, Doric Greek, Ionic Greek, each city-state with its own linguistic fingerprint. You don't speak any of them. So here you are, surrounded by people, in the middle of one of history's most celebrated civilizations, completely and utterly mute, unable to ask for directions, unable to explain yourself, unable to answer the increasingly suspicious questions being directed at you by people who are noticing, very quickly, that something about you is deeply, fundamentally wrong. Your clothes are wrong, your posture is wrong, your haircut is wrong, the way you make eye contact is wrong. Every invisible social rule that Greeks absorbed from birth, the etiquette around gender interaction, around social hierarchy, around how you address someone of higher status, you're breaking all of them simultaneously without even realizing it. And in ancient Greece, breaking those rules didn't get you a polite correction. It got you labeled. A stranger with no papers, no known family, no city-state affiliation, no understandable language, and behavior that nobody around you can explain had exactly two likely classifications in ancient Greece: mentally ill, or an undocumented foreigner. And both of those classifications led to the same place. Enslavement. Not metaphorical enslavement, not social exclusion. Actual, literal, physical enslavement. Within hours of arriving in the greatest intellectual civilization in human history, you would be stripped of every freedom you've ever taken for granted, because you couldn't say your own name in a way anyone understood. But let's say you somehow navigate that. Let's say through a combination of extraordinary luck and frantic mime, you manage to avoid the slave traders in your first hour. You still have a problem. Because somewhere between the chaos of arriving and the exhausting performance of pretending to belong, you've picked something up. A scratch, a fever, a stomach cramp that's getting worse by the minute. You need a doctor, and that is where your day goes from bad to something genuinely, historically, unforgettably worse. Let's talk about Greek medicine, and I want you to approach this section with the same energy you'd bring to a horror movie, because that's essentially what it is. Greek physicians operated under a system that was, in its own way, impressively organized and catastrophically wrong. The dominant medical philosophy of the era, built largely on the work of Hippocrates, the man modern medicine still takes its oath from, held that the body was governed by four humors. Sound familiar? Because the Romans borrowed this directly from the Greeks. The original sin of Western medicine traced back to a single wrong idea that killed people for the next 2,000 years. But Greece had its own additions to the horror. If you were sick, truly sick, fever and chills and unable to move, and you couldn't afford a physician, the prescribed solution was the temple of Asclepius. Asclepius being the Greek god of medicine and healing. And the treatment offered at his temple was straightforward. You would be brought into a sacred sleeping hall. The hall would be populated with live snakes, considered sacred to Asclepius. And you would sleep there, overnight, alone, in the dark, with the snakes. The belief was that Asclepius would visit you in your dreams and either heal you directly or deliver instructions for your treatment through the dream itself. If you woke up healed, divine miracle. If you woke up in the same condition, try again tomorrow. If you didn't wake up at all, well, the god works in mysterious ways. And if you did manage to find an actual physician, bloodletting was the standard opening move for almost every condition. Running a fever? They'd drain you. Suffering from headaches? Drain you. Chest pain? Drain you. The logic being, as with Rome, that removing blood removed whatever excess humor was causing the problem. The fact that patients consistently got worse after being bled was apparently not sufficient evidence to reconsider the approach. Now, if you were a woman seeking medical help in ancient Greece, the situation took a turn that managed to be simultaneously more absurd and more sinister. Greek physicians operated under the genuine medical belief that the uterus was a free-floating organ. Not fixed in place, actually mobile, wandering around the body at will. And when it wandered, when it migrated upward toward the chest or the head, it caused illness, anxiety, breathing difficulties, fainting, depression. Essentially, any symptom a woman reported was potentially attributable to her uterus deciding to take a walk. The prescribed treatment for a wandering womb? Pregnancy. Almost universally, for almost any female ailment, the medical recommendation was to become pregnant as quickly as possible, which was, to put it as charitably as possible, not a medical treatment. It was a social agenda wearing a physician's robe. And while all of this was happening, while you were being bled or snake-dreamed or told your uterus was on a journey, if you were attempting to blend into upper-class Greek society, you might have reached for the one thing that separated the wealthy from the common. The beauty standard of the era: white skin. Pale, almost luminous skin that signaled you didn't work outdoors, didn't labor in the sun, belonged to the class of people who thought and debated rather than sweated and carried. The product used to achieve this look was white lead paste, applied directly to the face and neck, daily. By women, and some men who had absolutely no idea that they were coating themselves in one of the most potent neurotoxins available in the ancient world. Slow poisoning, neurological deterioration, organ failure, all in the name of looking fashionable for a society that was about to demonstrate it didn't particularly care about you anyway. Because here's the thing about ancient Greek society that the philosophy textbooks consistently forgot to mention. The famous Athenian democracy, the system that inspired every democratic government that followed it, the idea that gets credited to Greece in every political science class ever taught, applied to an almost laughably small fraction of the actual population. To vote in Athens, you had to be a male citizen. Born in Athens, of Athenian parents, over 18. Not enslaved. That's it. That's the democracy. Everyone else, and everyone else was the overwhelming majority, existed outside it entirely. Women had no political rights, no legal independence, no ability to own property, conduct business, or appear in court without a male guardian representing them. A Greek woman of the classical period moved from the legal ownership of her father directly to the legal ownership of her husband, without ever passing through a moment of autonomous existence. Foreigners, medics as they were called, could live in Athens, could work, could pay taxes, could not vote, could not own land, could not access the political system in any meaningful way. You were tolerated, you were useful, you were not welcome in the rooms where decisions were made. And then there were the enslaved. Up to 80% of the population in some Greek city-states were enslaved people. 80%. The philosophical debates, the architectural marvels, the Olympic Games, the theatrical performances, the leisure time that made all of that intellectual flourishing possible, it was all built on the labor of people who had no rights, no freedom, no recourse, and no exit. The birthplace of democracy was, for the vast majority of people living in it, a place where democracy was something that happened to other people. And if Athens sounds bad, if the democracy myth and the slave economy and the complete legal erasure of women sounds like enough, then you have clearly not yet considered what was happening 200 miles southwest, Sparta. Sparta was a civilization built around a single organizing principle, the creation of the perfect warrior. Everything else was secondary. Everything. Comfort, family, individual identity, mercy. All of it subordinated to the machine. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and entered into the agoge, a brutal state education system designed not to teach them philosophy or mathematics, but to break them, repeatedly, and see what came out the other side. Beatings were not punishment in Sparta. They were curriculum. Hunger was deliberately induced to teach boys to steal food, and then they were beaten if they were caught stealing. Not for stealing, for getting caught. Because a Spartan warrior who gets caught is a Spartan warrior who failed. Girls in Sparta fared slightly better than their Athenian counterparts in physical terms. They were trained, fed well, allowed to exercise, but only because strong women produce strong soldiers. Their value was entirely biological. Their freedom was slightly wider cage, and outside both cities, outside the walls of any Greek city-state, the world was not waiting patiently. Pirates controlled significant portions of the Mediterranean coastline. Bandits operated freely on the roads between cities. Neighboring city-states existed in a state of almost permanent low-level conflict that regularly escalated into full-scale war. The Peloponnesian War alone, Athens versus Sparta, consumed nearly 3 decades and left both civilizations fundamentally, permanently weakened. Step outside the walls of your city without protection, without connections, without the right papers and the right language and the right social affiliations. And ancient Greece will finish what the doctors started. So what did surviving ancient Greece actually do to a person? The bones tell the story again. Just like Rome, just like every ancient civilization we peel back far enough, the archaeological record of ancient Greece is a physical ledger of everything daily life cost the people living it. Skeletal remains from classical Greek burial sites show chronic malnutrition in the lower classes. Spinal compression and joint deterioration from years of agricultural and construction labor beginning in childhood. Dental erosion, stunted growth in individuals who simply never received adequate nutrition during their developmental years. Bodies that were, by modern medical standards, significantly older than their actual age in every measurable way. The average life expectancy in classical Greece sat somewhere between 28 and 35 years. And the causes weren't dramatic. They weren't battlefield wounds or gladiatorial combat. They were quiet, cumulative, and utterly mundane. Bad water, inadequate food, untreated infections, and the occasional physician making everything catastrophically worse. But the physical cost was only half of it. Think about the psychological weight of living inside ancient Greek society with no possibility of exit and no mechanism for change. For the enslaved, and remember, that was potentially 80% of the people around you, every single day was lived inside a system that had legally, socially, and philosophically decided that you were not a person. That your labor, your body, your children, your entire existence belonged to someone else. Permanently, with no appeal and no horizon. For women, even wealthy women, life was conducted almost entirely within the walls of the home. The gymnasium, the women's quarters, separated from public life, from intellectual life, from political life, not by circumstance but by deliberate, codified, philosophically justified design. Aristotle himself, the man whose ideas shaped Western thinking for 2,000 years, wrote that women were, by nature, inferior to men and properly suited to domestic subjugation. When the most celebrated intellectual in your civilization has put your inferiority in writing, there is nowhere to appeal. There is no higher authority, there is only endurance. And endurance, in ancient Greece, had a very specific expiry date. So here's the part where it gets complicated. Because ancient Greece did give us something real, something genuinely, consequentially important, and pretending otherwise, in the interest of a cleaner narrative, would be its own kind of dishonesty. Democracy as a concept, not the practice. We've established how narrow and exclusionary the practice actually was. But the idea, the radical, world-altering proposition that ordinary people should have a say in how they are governed. That power should have a mechanism for accountability. That the state exists to serve the citizen rather than the other way around. That idea came from Greece, imperfectly, hypocritically, built on the backs of people it deliberately excluded, but articulated, written down, released into the world. Philosophy, mathematics, theatrical drama as an art form, the scientific method in its earliest recognizable form. The Olympic Games, the idea that competing civilizations could agree temporarily to put down their weapons and measure themselves against each other in something other than warfare. These weren't small contributions. They were the seeds of virtually everything the modern world considers foundational to civilized society, and every single one of them was made possible by slave labor. That's the equation that ancient Greece left us with. And it's one that historians have spent centuries either minimizing or ignoring entirely because it's deeply uncomfortable to hold both things simultaneously. The Parthenon is genuinely beautiful. The people who built it had no choice. Socrates asked questions that changed the trajectory of human thought. The economy that gave him the leisure time to ask them was built on human suffering at a scale that should make us deeply, permanently uneasy. This is Greece's real legacy, not the marble, not the philosophy, but the question it forces us to ask about every civilization that produces extraordinary things. Who paid for it? And are we still asking that question about our own? And that is the real Greece. Not the philosophy seminar, not the marble paradise, not the story your history teacher told you with the nice diagrams and the glossy textbook illustrations. The actual Greece, brutal, brilliant, and built on foundations that nobody putting it on a pedestal wants to look at too closely. But here's what's starting to become a pattern. Because Mesopotamia had the same problem. And after Greece, long after the Parthenon, long after Socrates, long after democracy was even a word, there was another civilization. Older, larger, and in the ways it controlled, punished, and disposed of the people living inside it, even more ruthless than either of them. We went there next. It's waiting for you right here.